On the afternoon of August 27th, 1875, a man worth more than the entire Pacific Coast Treasury walked out of his own bank with nothing. He had just signed away a silver empire, a country palace, and the largest hotel on earth, all in a single, trembling signature. 2 hours later, William Chapman Ralston waded into the cold green waters of San Francisco Bay and never walked out again. Just blocks away, 755 empty rooms waited for a grand opening their builder would never see. The Palace Hotel was about to open. Its creator was already drowning. Chapter 1. The Man Who Could Not Stop Building. Before the palace rose, before the silver flowed, there was a boy from Ohio who believed that ambition was a form of prayer. William Chapman Ralston was born in the river town of Wellsville in 1826, the son of a carpenter who taught him that a straight beam was a kind of truth. He left home at 12. He worked the Mississippi steamboats in the days when a riverboat clerk counted his future in handshakes and whiskey. By the time he was 23, he had crossed oceans. By the time he was 27, he had landed in San Francisco with the gold rush still coughing silt from its lungs, and he walked the wooden planks of Montgomery Street as if he had been promised the place in a dream. He did not look like a conqueror. He was short and round-faced, with sandy hair thinning at the crown, and a smile that opened easily and wide. But something in him refused to sit still. He became a shipping agent, then a private banker. Then, in 1864, the co-founder of the Bank of California, the most powerful financial institution west of the Rocky Mountains. Within a decade, the bank held more than $40 million in deposits. Its vaults swallowed the gold of the Sierras and the silver of Nevada. Its credit kept the wheels of a young state turning. Ralston did not simply work at the bank, he inhabited it. He arrived each morning before the clerks and stayed long after the gas jets were turned down for the night. He knew every depositor by name. He extended loans on handshakes. He once wrote a personal check for $40,000 to keep a struggling woolen mill alive, because he believed San Francisco ought to weave its own cloth. He invested in sugar refineries, in watchmakers, in vineyards, in furniture factories, in a dry dock at Hunter's Point, so large it could swallow a clipper ship whole. They called him the Magnificent. Every morning at dawn, he galloped a fast horse through the fog of Golden Gate Park, his hat low, the sea wind cutting his face. He once rode 17 miles down the peninsula to his country house at Belmont in 53 minutes. The horse never recovered. Neither did he. He had the temperament of a man who could not understand delay. At Belmont, he built a 100-room mansion in the Italianate style, with a ballroom mirrored in silver leaf, and a dinner table that could seat 120 guests without pressing elbows. He fed them all. He never asked who they were. In 1870, a little valley town in Stanislaus County petitioned the legislature to name itself Ralston. He refused. He thought it immodest, so they named it Modesto instead, Spanish for modest, a joke he never seemed to notice. That was the paradox of the man. He refused a town and built a palace. He blushed at honors and mortgaged a city. His wife Elizabeth bore him 4 children. He loved her in the distracted way of men who love a great many things at once. He wrote her letters full of apology and calendar. He missed birthdays. He missed dinners. He missed the quiet years she had hoped to share. Sometimes, on the long ride back from Belmont, he would stop the carriage at the ridge above Crystal Springs and stare down at the fog pouring into the bay. and for a moment, he would say nothing at all. He believed San Francisco could outshine London. He said it often. He said it so often that the city began to believe him. And so, when he stood on the muddy corner of Market and New Montgomery in December of 1873 and looked out across 2.5 acres of empty land and turned to his architect and said, "Build me the largest hotel on earth," the architect did not ask why. He only asked how tall. What kind of man builds an 800-fireplace palace for strangers? The answer, perhaps, was this: a man who had mistaken a city for a mirror. A man who believed that if he built fast enough, and wide enough, and high enough, the numbers would catch up with the dream. They never did. Chapter 2: The Silver That Was Never Enough. Beneath a mountain in Nevada lay a vein of ore so rich it rewrote the definition of wealth in the American imagination. They called it the Comstock Lode. I named for a wandering sheep herder who sold his claim for a horse and a bottle of whiskey. The lode ran underneath Mount Davidson in what would soon become Virginia City, and when it was first cut open in 1859, the miners thought they had struck a blue-black clay that was ruining their gold pans. A chemist in Grass Valley ran an assay. The clay was almost pure silver. A single ton of it was worth thousands of dollars. By the middle of the 1860s, Virginia City had become the richest square mile on Earth. 20,000 people lived on a mountainside that had no trees, no water, and no reason to exist except the ore humming beneath their boots. The shafts went down 3,000 feet. The heat at the lowest levels reached 130 degrees. Men worked stripped to the waist, drinking 12 quarts of ice water a day, and still died of what they called miners' consumption. Mules were lowered on platforms and never returned to daylight. In 30 years, the mountain gave up more than $300 million in silver and gold. Converted to the money of a later century, it was a treasury larger than some nations. William Ralston saw the mountain, and he saw the machinery around it. He understood, before most men did, that the real wealth of the Comstock was not the silver. It was the credit. The mines needed pumps. The pumps needed engines. The engines needed water. The water needed flumes. The flumes needed timber. The timber needed mills. Every mill, every flume, every pump was a loan, and every loan was collateral. He formed a partnership with a man named William Sharon. Sharon had come west from Illinois, a lawyer with a face like a closed book. He was small, pale, careful with his words and careful with his enemies. Where Ralston was loud, Sharon was silent. Where Ralston gave, Sharon counted. In 1864, Ralston sent him to Virginia City to manage the Bank of California's branch there. Sharon arrived in a town where mining stocks rose and fell in a single afternoon, and he began, quietly, to build a trap. He offered mine owners loans at 2% a month, 24% a year, compounded. It was not unreasonable by frontier standards. It was, however, unsurvivable. When a mine missed a payment, Sharon foreclosed. When a mill ran out of cash, Sharon bought it. Within 5 years, he and Ralston controlled 7 of the largest mills on the Comstock through a holding company called the Union Mill and Mining Company. They owned the water. They owned the timber flumes. They owned the railroad that carried the ore down the mountain. They called themselves the bank crowd. The phrase was meant to sound respectable. It was not. Rival mine owners learned to fear the sound of Sharon's voice in a boardroom. He could speak for an hour without raising it, and by the end, a company would no longer be yours. He drove one partner to suicide. he drove another back east to die of grief. Ralston, in San Francisco, did not see it that way. He believed he was building an empire of prosperity. He believed the silver was a tide that would lift every ship. He believed, above all, in William Sharon. He should not have. And there is a kind of partnership that looks, from the outside, like a friendship. Two men who rise together, who trust each other with signatures and secrets, who share the weight of an enterprise too large for one. From the inside, it can be something else entirely. A slow, patient arrangement in which one man does the building and the other watches, and waits and calculates the precise hour at which the builder's exhaustion will make him vulnerable. By 1873, the Comstock was beginning to tremble. The richest ore bodies had been cut through. The deeper shafts were flooding faster than the pumps could clear them. A great financial panic swept the East Coast that September, and its tremors reached California within weeks. Credit contracted. Stocks fell. Ralston doubled down. He bought more mines. He built more mills. He lent the bank's money to his own ventures, sometimes without proper signatures, sometimes without any signatures at all. He believed the silver would return. Sharon believed something else. He began, very quietly, to sell. The dark partnership had a name only history would learn to use. It was the partnership that would one day dine, without hesitation and without remorse, on its own architect. Chapter 3: A Palace Conceived in Marble and Pride. In December of 1873, Ralston told his architect to copy every hotel on Earth and then to make it larger. The architect was John P. Gaynor, an Irish-born New Yorker who had designed the cast-iron Hofwout building on Broadway and knew what the new age of steel and masonry could do. Gaynor listened to Ralston across a table covered in blueprints. Ralston wanted the marble of the Grand Hotel in Paris. He wanted the rising rooms of the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York. He wanted the ironwork of the Langham in London. He wanted every wonder of the age stacked into a single building, on a single block, in a city that had not yet paved half its streets. Gaynor asked how many rooms. Ralston said 755. No hotel in the world, at that moment, had more than 500. The land had already been chosen. It was a wedge-shaped parcel on the corner of New Montgomery and Market Street, 2.5 acres of former sand dune that Ralston had bought for $400,000. He had bought it characteristically with his own money because the bank directors had balked at the price. He intended to sell it back to a holding company later at cost. He never quite got around to the paperwork. The original budget was $850,000. Within a year, it had doubled. By the time the last carpet was nailed down, it would reach $5 million. In the money of a later century, that was more than $150 million spent on a single building at a time when a skilled carpenter earned $4 a day. Ralston did not flinch. He did not even slow down. He bought his own brick yard at Mount Diablo so that he could control the quality and the price of the masonry. He bought his own lumber mill in the Sierras. He bought his own furniture factory in the Mission District so that every chair, every wardrobe, every carved bed frame would come from a shop he owned. He bought a woolen mill to weave the carpets. He bought a stone quarry at Greenfield to cut the marble. If the palace was to be built, it would be built, every stick and stone of it, from the sinews of enterprises he himself controlled. It was an act of vertical integration 3 decades before the phrase existed. It was also an act of catastrophic overextension. Construction began in the spring of 1874. 1,100 workmen swarmed the site. The walls rose in courses of brick, 20 million of them in total, each one laid by hand. The outer walls were 2 feet thick at the base. Through them, at intervals of every 4 feet, ran iron rods tying the building together like the ribs of a ship. Gaynor had been to Chicago after the fire of 1871. He had studied the way masonry failed under heat. He designed the palace to survive what other buildings could not. Scientific American magazine would later send a correspondent to tour the unfinished structure, and he would come away stunned. He compared the walls to the side of a warship, spotted with the round heads of bolts and reinforced with iron as if preparing for cannonade. The palace, he wrote, was not a hotel. It was a fortress disguised as a dream. A scale paragraph becomes necessary here. Consider the numbers: 20 million bricks, 900 tons of iron rods, 31,000 tons of concrete in the foundation, 755 guest rooms, 800 fireplaces, 512 gas jets in the central court alone, 4 artesian wells sunk 600 feet into the ground, a cistern beneath the cellars holding 675,000 gallons of water, enough to fight a fire for 12 hours without resupply. A single building, rising 9 stories on a 2.5-acre lot, intended to hold 1,200 guests and 1,200 servants, 6,000 people under one roof on a heavy weekend. No hotel of that scale had ever existed. No hotel of that scale would exist again for decades. Every day, Ralston visited the site. He walked the scaffolding in his banker's suit, his pocket watch swinging, his eyes climbing the bones of the building. He shook hands with bricklayers. He knew the foreman by name. He paid the workers an extra 50 cents a day because he believed men built better when they believed in what they were building. The city watched with a kind of reverent disbelief. San Franciscans began to drive their carriages down Market Street on Sundays just to see the walls go up. And all the while, floor by floor, the dream rose, and the numbers climbed, and somewhere inside the vaults of the Bank of California, the foundations of its financing began, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. Chapter 4. The ironclad rising on Market Street. Scientific American compared its walls to a warship, spotted with bolt heads and ribbed with iron rods running through the brick like veins. When the Palace Hotel stood finished in the autumn of 1875, it was the largest building of its kind on the planet. It covered 2.5 acres. It rose 9 stories into a sky that had, until then, been broken only by church steeples and the masts of ships in the bay. A visitor arriving on Market Street would see it long before he reached it. A pale cliff of brick and bay windows and cast iron balconies, wearing the white light of California like a second skin. The main entrance opened onto the Grand Court. It was an inner carriage courtyard, 84 feet wide and 144 feet long, roofed in glass so high above the floor that the first guests would crane their necks and forget where they were. 7 stories of white balconies looked down into it, tier on tier, like the boxes of an opera house. A carriage could drive in directly from New Montgomery Street, deposit its passengers, and circle back out the other side. The floor was paved in marble. Potted palms stood 12 feet high. A small orchestra played on a platform most afternoons. At night, the Grand Court was lit by 512 gas jets. Each jet threw a soft pear-colored light. Together, they turned the court into a sphere of glow, as if the hotel were a lantern with 755 windows. Later, in 1888, the gas would be replaced by electric arc lamps, But in that first year, it was flame. It was always flame. The rising rooms were a wonder. 5 of them. They were hydraulic, driven by water pressure from the artesian wells. A guest stepped into a gilded cage lined with red plush, and a boy in a pillbox hat pulled a brass lever, and the room moved. It moved slowly. It moved in perfect silence. It carried the guest upward through the sleeping floors of the hotel, as if he were ascending in a dream. Most Americans had never seen such a thing. A small number of them fainted the first time they tried. The guest rooms were arranged along corridors wide enough for 2 carriages. Every room had its own fireplace. Every room had its own private bathroom, a thing almost unheard of in a hotel of that era, where most establishments still expected their patrons to share a single tub at the end of a hall. Every room had an electric bell wired to a central board in the servants' hall. Every room had a speaking tube. Every room had a clock, a writing desk, a marble washstand, and a carpet so thick that footfalls vanished. There were parlors. There were reading rooms. There was a bar longer than any saloon in the West. There were Turkish baths in the basement. There was a barber shop with 12 chairs. There was a billiard room with 16 tables. There was a library. There was a telegraph office. There was a drugstore. There was a bakery that produced 20,000 rolls a day. There was a laundry capable of washing 10,000 sheets between one sunrise and the next. The water alone was a small miracle. 4 artesian wells sunk 600 feet into the sand beneath the hotel, pumped steadily into a reservoir on the roof and into the great cistern in the cellar. 675,000 gallons. The cistern was built to survive any fire that might come. It had its own independent pumping system. It was intended, Ralston said, to make the palace the one building in San Francisco that could never burn. The dining room seated 1,200. The silver service had been custom forged. The plates carried the initials PH in a monogram so careful it looked embroidered. The wine cellar held 60,000 bottles. The kitchens employed 70 cooks and worked 20 hours a day. And yet, every wonder was mortgaged twice. The land was pledged as collateral on a loan from the Bank of California. The building itself was pledged as collateral on a second loan from the same bank. The furniture, the fixtures, the carpets, the silver, all of it was pledged in a tangle of overlapping agreements that would, in later months, confound even the bank's own lawyers. The truth was that by the time the palace was ready to open, it had already been signed away twice over to cover Ralston's other ventures. The carpets beneath a senator's boots belonged, technically, to a bondholder in New York. The artesian wells were secured against a loan from a Hamburg banking house. Even the 1,200 embroidered napkins in the dining room, monogrammed with the hotel's initials, had been pledged as part of a chattel mortgage. Ralston knew. He had to know. He was the man who had signed every one of those papers. But he behaved in those final months like a man walking across a frozen lake, listening for the sound of the ice, and refusing, absolutely refusing, to stop moving forward. He hosted pre-opening banquets in the unfinished dining room. He showed reporters through the bridal suite. He told a journalist from the Sacramento Bee that the palace was, quote, a gift to the American people, unquote. What he meant, perhaps, was that it had become a gift to his creditors. The building looked, to anyone standing outside on Market Street, like the most solid thing in the West. The ironclad, the fortress, the future. Inside, the numbers were rotting through the floorboards. A scale paragraph at this juncture, earns its keep. 755 rooms, 800 fireplaces, 5 rising rooms, 4 artesian wells, 675,000 gallons of stored water, $5 million sunk into brick and marble, 20 million individual bricks laid by hand, 900 tons of iron banding the whole structure together, and behind all of it, $5 million of paper debt woven through the Bank of California's books, twisted, relayered, rehypothecated, waiting for the first hard wind to pull it apart. The palace was ready. San Francisco held its breath. The doors were locked, waiting for October. And somewhere in the basement, a woman was already lighting her first lamp of the morning, because the invisible city beneath the skylight had already begun its shift. Chapter 5: The Invisible City Beneath the Skylight. For every king who slept beneath silk on the 6th floor, a woman scrubbed his sheets in the basement for $8 a month. The Palace Hotel was 2 buildings stacked on top of each other. The upper one was visible. It had marble and mirrors and morning sunlight pouring through the grand court. The lower one was invisible. It existed beneath the street level in a warren of tiled corridors, steam pipes, coal chutes, and gas-lit service halls. It had no windows. It had no ornament. It had no rest. 1,200 people worked in the palace. Some estimates place the number higher, closer to 1,500 at peak season. They outnumbered the guests almost 1 to 1. They did not enter through the grand doors on Market Street. They entered through a narrow service gate on Jesse Street at 5 in the morning, and they left through the same gate long after midnight. The head waiters were African American men, most of them recruited from the dining cars of the transcontinental railroads and brought west by express train. They were prized for their training, their precision, their silence, and their willingness to work for wages no white waiter would accept. They lived in dormitories in the basement, 6 men to a room, 2 shifts to a bed. They earned $20 a month and an additional few dollars in tips that were pooled and redistributed by the captain of the dining room. A single misstep, a dropped soup plate, a word answered in the wrong tone, and a man could be dismissed before the end of his shift. There was no appeal. There was no record. The chambermaids were Irish, mostly, with a smaller number of German and Scandinavian girls newly arrived. They began work at 5. They cleaned until noon. They cleaned again from 2 to 9. A single chambermaid was assigned 20 rooms. She carried her own coal. She laid her own fires. She changed her own linen. She emptied her own chamber pots. On Sundays, she was permitted a single afternoon off, during which she was not, technically, allowed to leave the building. The laundry was in the sub-basement. It was run almost entirely by Chinese workers. Their names were not recorded in any surviving roster. The census takers of the period listed most of them simply as Chinamen or Chinese laundress, a generic entry that erased the individual in the act of counting them. They worked in a room of permanent steam. The floors ran with hot water. They ironed starched sheets with irons weighing 14 pounds. They earned, according to the surviving pay ledgers of the era, $8 a month. $8. In the same building, and sometimes on the very same day, a corner suite on the 7th floor rented for $100 a night. The arithmetic was brutal. A laundryman would have had to work more than 12 months to pay for a single night in a room whose sheets he had washed that morning. The kitchens employed 70 cooks and a further 160 kitchen boys, bakers, butchers, vegetable cutters, and dishwashers. The meat came in on its own rail car, directly from the stockyards at South San Francisco. The vegetables came in twice a day from farms across the bay. The ice was cut from Sierra lakes in winter and stored in sawdust-filled warehouses, then hauled in block by teams of horses. A single banquet in the palace dining room might consume 400 pounds of beef, 300 pounds of fish, 80 pounds of butter, and 240 bottles of wine. At the center of the invisible city was an object of quiet genius and quieter menace. The electric call button. Every guest room had one. The guest pressed it. In the servants' hall, a small panel of indicators lit up, each marked with the number of the room. A bellboy, a chambermaid, or a waiter was dispatched within 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That was the standard. The head butler enforced it with a pocket watch. Slower than 2 minutes. And the offending servant was docked a quarter of his day's wage. It is easy, reading this now, to hear the call button as a convenience. It was not. It was an instrument of surveillance. It was a mechanism that tied the body of the servant to the idle finger of the guest in a way no bell rope had ever done. It tracked response time. It counted summonses. It produced, for the first time in American hospitality, a statistical record of servant performance. 100 years later, historians would look at its circuit diagrams and recognize, with discomfort, the ancestor of the modern surveillance workplace. Above, on the 5th floor, a silk merchant from New York was ringing for fresh lemons at 2 in the morning. Below, a boy of 15 was running up 7 flights of service stairs because the rising rooms were reserved for guests. That he would arrive winded. He would not be permitted to show it. He would carry the lemons on a silver tray covered in a linen cloth. He would knock twice. He would bow. He would earn that month $12. The palace was the most modern hotel in the world. It was also one of the most hierarchical. Its architecture was vertical. Its inequality was vertical. The higher you rose in the building, the softer the light, the deeper the carpet, the whiter the faces. The lower you descended, the hotter the steam, the darker the walls, the more foreign the names that were never written down. 800 fireplaces upstairs, $8 a month downstairs. And all of this, every rolled towel and polished spoon, was ready to open. The ribbon was cut. The doors were thrown back. The guests streamed in. Somewhere in a private office on Montgomery Street, the man who had built all of it was dying inside his shoes. And he did not yet know that the man in the next office, his partner, his friend, his co-conspirator of 2 decades, had already begun to count the hours until it would all belong to him alone. Chapter 6. The Partner Who Smelled Blood. While Ralston dreamed in stone, William Sharon was counting the hours until he could own it all for pennies. In the summer of 1875, Sharon was 54 years old. He was a widower. His wife Maria had died the previous April in the big house on Washington Street after a long decline. He had buried her without ceremony. He had resumed work the next day. Those who knew him said he had always been cold. After Maria, he became something colder still. He stopped attending church. He stopped laughing at jokes. He stopped, if he had ever truly started, pretending to be anything other than what he was. That winter, he had bought a seat in the United States Senate. He had bought it. The phrase was not metaphorical. In the politics of 19th century Nevada, a senator was chosen not by the voters, but by the state legislature. Sharon had approached the legislators of Nevada one by one, and he had offered them, variously, cash, mining stock, loans, debts forgiven, and positions at his bank. By the time the vote was taken in January, the outcome was a formality. He had spent, by the estimate of his own campaign manager, $1 million. He took his oath in March. He rarely attended a session. Being a senator was useful. It gave him access to information that the ordinary speculator did not possess. It gave him immunity from certain kinds of lawsuit. And it gave him, above all, a title. Senator Sharon. The words carried a weight that banker Sharon had never quite achieved. He used the title with each new introduction, and he watched the men in the room adjust themselves around it. Through the spring and early summer of 1875, Sharon studied the books of the Bank of California with a quiet, continuous attention. He had always kept a second set of ledgers for himself, recording the bank's internal exposures as he understood them. The numbers in those ledgers had begun, that spring, to alarm him. Ralston had overextended in every direction. The palace, the Spring Valley Water Company, which Ralston had tried to buy and sell back to the city at a $12 million profit. The Mission Woolen Mills and the Furniture Works, the dry dock at Hunter's Point, the California Theater, the Cornell Watch Company, each one a loan, each one a collateral pledge, each one a wager against the continued productivity of the Comstock mines. The Comstock was failing. Sharon knew it before anyone else. The deeper ore bodies were playing out. New ones might be found, but they might not. In July, he began, very quietly, to sell his own Comstock holdings. He sold the Offer. He sold the Belcher. He sold the Crown Point. He did not sell through his own brokers. He used intermediaries in New York and London. He sold slowly, over weeks, so as not to break the market. By the middle of August, he had converted roughly $3 million of Comstock stock into cash and government bonds. He kept the transactions off the books of the Bank of California. He kept them off his own books as well, so far as the bank could see. He did not warn Ralston. He did not warn anyone. On the afternoon of August the 25th, he crossed a line he had been approaching for some time. He gave the order to dump a large block of Ophir stock onto the open market, all at once, without price support. The stock had been trading at around $65 a share. By the end of the day, it had collapsed to $39. By the next morning, it had dropped below $30. Mining stocks across the Comstock cratered in sympathy. Investors began to panic. Rumors flew. A clerk at the Bank of Nevada told a friend that the Bank of California was exposed to tens of millions in mining collateral. The friend told two more. By the evening of August 25th, the story had reached every brokerage on Montgomery Street. Depositors began, the next morning, to walk into the marble lobby of the Bank of California and to ask, politely, for their money in gold. Ralston met with Sharon on the evening of August 25th. The meeting lasted less than an hour. What passed between the two men has never been fully reconstructed. We know that Ralston asked Sharon for help. We know that Sharon listened, expressionless, and then said that he would think the matter over. We know that Sharon left the building, walked 3 blocks to his own office, and there signed a series of documents that would, over the next 36 hours, transfer to himself, personally, the beneficial control of nearly every asset Ralston owned. There is a certain kind of betrayal that requires years of preparation. It is not loud. It does not slam doors. It sits across a desk from a friend and nods and takes notes and asks thoughtful questions and waits. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of August 26th, the doors of the Bank of California were closed. A sign was posted on the outer gate, hand-lettered in black ink. It read simply, "Closed." That was all. No explanation, no date of reopening. The crowd on Sansom Street stood for a long time in silence, and then, in slow groups, began to move away. Inside, Ralston sat in his office. His shirt was open at the collar. He had been in the building since 6 that morning. On his desk lay a telegram from a correspondent bank in New York, refusing further credit. On the floor beside his chair lay a newspaper, folded open to a story about the opening of the Palace Hotel, scheduled for 5 weeks hence. And he had crossed the point of no return, and he did not yet know that the man crossing it with him, arm in arm, had already stepped to the other side. Chapter 7. 36 hours to lose everything. On a Thursday morning, several thousand frightened depositors gathered at Sansom and California streets, and the empire began to empty in cash. The date was August the 26th, 1875. The weather was fine. A light wind moved up Market Street from the bay. The cable cars had not yet been invented. The streets were still crowded with horse-drawn streetcars and drays. By 8 in the morning, a line had formed at the doors of the Bank of California. By 9, the line reached around the block. By 10, it had doubled back on itself. The crowd was not, at first, angry. It was afraid. Most of the people in it were small depositors, shopkeepers, widows, clerks, sailors who had saved a season's pay, Chinese merchants clutching passbooks in silk pouches, a nun from the Presentation Convent holding a cloth bag of school tuition money. They had heard the rumors in the night, and now they wanted simply to hold their money in their own hands. The bank opened its doors at 10 o'clock. The tellers began to pay out. They paid in gold coin because the depositors insisted on it. Gold is heavy. A teller could count out $1,000 in double eagles in about 2 minutes. The line moved slowly. The pile of coins on the counter grew. The pile in the vault shrank. Inside his office on the 2nd floor, Ralston received reports every 15 minutes. By noon, the bank had paid out $600,000. By 1 in 900,000. The vault, which had opened the day with about $2 million in gold, was running through its reserves faster than any bank in San Francisco history. Ralston sent for additional specie from the branch offices. There was not enough. He sent for loans from other banks. They refused. He sent telegrams to friends in New York. They had already heard. At 2 o'clock, a message was brought up from the main floor. The bank was within 30 minutes of exhausting its gold. Ralston read the note, folded it, and placed it inside his vest pocket. He went downstairs. He spoke briefly to the head cashier. At 2:30, the cashier walked to the front doors, asked the crowd to stand back, and closed them. The locks were thrown. A clerk hung a small printed sign in the window. Bank of California, it read, is temporarily closed. That was all. Outside, for a long moment, there was no sound at all. Then a man in a black coat at the back of the crowd began to weep. Then a woman, then others. Someone shouted that the bank would never reopen. Someone else shouted for the police. The crowd surged forward and the doors held. Within an hour, the news had reached every bar, every church, every market in the city. By nightfall, the entire credit structure of the American West was under siege. 4 other San Francisco banks closed within 48 hours. Mining stocks lost half their value by the following morning. Depositors in Sacramento, Stockton, and San Jose began runs of their own. Ralston did not leave his office. He sat through the afternoon watching the shadows lengthen across his desk. He wrote letters. He tore them up. He dictated a brief statement to his secretary and then refused to let her send it. At 6, he ate a piece of bread and butter with a glass of milk. At 7, he took the ferry across the bay to Oakland and then the train back down the peninsula to Belmont. At Belmont, the windows were lit. His wife Elizabeth had been told nothing of the day. His 4 children were asleep. He walked through the ballroom he had built, past the 100 vacant dining chairs of the unlit banquet hall, and into the small study at the back of the house. He closed the door. He sat down. He did not weep. He wrote a single letter to his brother. Then he lay on the divan, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until the dawn came in through the high windows. At 5 in the morning, he took a light carriage back up the peninsula. He arrived at the bank at 7:30. The directors were already assembling. They were men he had known for 20 years, mill owners, bankers, a railroad president, a wool merchant. They looked at him as if he were a stranger. They did not offer their hands. The boardroom was stifling even at that hour. The windows had been closed against the noise of the crowd still gathered outside. A clerk had set out a pitcher of water and 1 drinking glass. No one reached for it. The chairman of the board was Darius Ogden Mills, the quiet, careful man who had founded the bank with Ralston in 1864. Mills had retired from active management years earlier. He had returned that morning specifically to preside over the end of things. He opened the meeting with a single sentence. He said that the auditors had worked through the night, and that the bank's position was far worse than anyone in the room had suspected. Then he read out the number. The Bank of California was insolvent by roughly $4 million. More than $1 million of that was in unauthorized paper notes that Ralston had signed to cover his personal ventures. The palace, the Kimball Carriage Company, the woolen mill, notes the directors had never seen, notes that had no legal basis, notes that, under the law as it then stood, could send a bank president to San Quentin for 10 years. Ralston listened. He did not defend himself. He did not speak at all. Mills finished reading, set the paper down, and looked across the table. The other directors looked at the wall, at their hands, at the floor. One of them, a man Ralston had personally lifted from bankruptcy 6 years before, cleared his throat and asked that Ralston resign the presidency of the bank, effective immediately. Ralston nodded. He was handed a single sheet of paper. He read it. Then he picked up the pen that had been laid, very deliberately, beside it. He signed without reading the full text. It was a deed of trust. It transferred, in a single stroke, every asset he personally owned into the hands of William Sharon. The Belmont estate, the shares in the Spring Valley Water Company, the Kimball Works, the furniture factory, the woolen mill, the 755-room hotel on Market Street. The ink was barely dry when Ralston stood up. He walked out of the boardroom. He walked down the marble stair. He walked out of the bank he had built and into the first afternoon of a life in which he owned, in law, not a single thing. Chapter 8. The signature that cost a fortune. He signed without reading, because reading would have required him to believe what the paper actually said. The deed of trust was a document of 6 pages, closely typed, prepared in advance by Sharon's attorneys. It had been drafted sometime between the evening of August 25th and the morning of August 27th, which meant that it had been written before the board even formally met. Sharon had known, before anyone had voted, how the meeting would end. He had known because, In every practical sense, he had written the ending himself. The document transferred as collateral against Ralston's personal debts to the Bank of California and against certain further obligations held personally by William Sharon, the entirety of Ralston's visible and invisible holdings. It was, on its face, a straightforward secured assignment. In practice, it was an instrument of annihilation. The debts against which Ralston's holdings were pledged were so stretched, so overlapping, so impossible to reconcile, that the transfer was effectively permanent. Every property he had built, every enterprise he had funded, every share he had held, now passed into the sole disposal of his partner. Sharon could, at his leisure, sell any of them, keep any of them, or simply foreclose on them at his own valuation. The value on paper was somewhere between $9 and $15 million. No one ever fully agreed on the figure. The tangle of cross-collateralized debt was so dense that even Sharon's own attorneys, reviewing the matter decades later, could not entirely reconstruct it. What was clear was that Ralston had, it's in a single signature, ceased to be a rich man and become a pauper. Of the 100-room mansion at Belmont, he now owned not one room. Of the 755-room Palace Hotel on Market Street, he now owned, as the lawyers would later put it, an interest of 0. When he left the bank, it was not yet noon. He did not go home. He did not send a telegram. He walked in his usual suit of black broadcloth, west on California Street, then north on Montgomery, then through the old produce district, and then toward the water. He was seen, variously, by at least a dozen witnesses, walking at a moderate and steady pace. He did not hurry. He did not seem distressed. He spoke to one acquaintance, tipped his hat to another. He stopped at his office at the Pacific Insurance Company for approximately 20 minutes. What he did there was not recorded. His secretary, questioned later, said that he went to his desk, wrote out a short note, and placed it inside a drawer. He locked the drawer. He took his hat from the stand. He left without speaking. Back at the Bank of California, in the boardroom Ralston had vacated only an hour before, William Sharon had already taken his seat at the head of the table. He was calm. He spoke in a low, even voice. He laid out his plan for the reopening of the bank. He would inject $1.5 million of his own capital. He would assume certain of Ralston's obligations. He would, in effect, rescue the institution. The directors, who an hour earlier had looked like men attending a funeral, now looked like men witnessing a resurrection. They voted, unanimously, to ratify Sharon's assumption of Ralston's assets. They did not discuss the moral geometry of it. Later that afternoon, a messenger arrived at the bank. He brought news that a man matching Ralston's description had been pulled from the bay near the Neptune bathhouse at North Beach, and that the man had not revived. The news was carried to Sharon at his desk. He was told in a low voice. The other directors waited to see his face. His expression did not change. According to the memoir of a junior clerk who was in the room, Sharon set down his pen, looked at the messenger for a moment, and said 4 words. Best thing he could have done. He said it quietly. He did not repeat it. He picked up his pen. He returned to the document in front of him. Those 4 words, 4 cold, careful, arithmetic words, would travel through the city faster than grief. They would appear within a week in every newspaper in California. They would be repeated at funerals and over brandy for the rest of Sharon's life, and for decades after he was dead. They would become the single sentence by which history remembered him. They were the epitaph he composed, without meaning to, for the man whose work had made him rich. Before the news reached the bank, Ralston had already walked the 2 miles from his office to North Beach. He had passed the warehouses and the chandlers and the small sail lofts near the water. He had passed men he knew and men he did not. He had arrived at the Neptune bathhouse shortly before 2 in the afternoon. He had paid his 25 cents. He had changed into a bathing costume. He had walked out onto the wooden dock that jutted over the cold green water. The bay that day was calm. The tide was slack. The water temperature was about 55 degrees, cold enough to shock the breath, cold enough to stop a weakened heart. A fishing boat was moving slowly across the middle distance, its brown sail up. A few swimmers were already in the water. Ralston stood on the edge of the dock for a moment, and then dove. What exactly went through his mind in those last quiet minutes, no one will ever know. He was alone with what he had become, and what he had become was a man who had built a city in his own image, and who had just signed, between breakfast and lunch, the deed of its repossession. Chapter 9. The bay closed over him. Witnesses at the Neptune bathhouse saw him swim strongly outward, then falter, and then vanish into the water that had watched him build everything. He was a powerful swimmer. Friends had known him to swim in the bay for an hour at a time. That afternoon, he made a clean, hard line away from the dock, moving north toward Alcatraz. 2 men on the pier watched him for perhaps 4 minutes. He was about 400 yards out when he rolled onto his back and lay still. Another swimmer, nearer to him, shouted. There was no response. A rowboat was launched. It took perhaps 3 minutes to reach him. When they pulled him from the water, he was unconscious. They turned him on his side, struck him between the shoulders, tried to force breath into him. His lips had gone blue. He did not stir. They rowed back to the dock and carried him, between 4 men, into the changing room of the bathhouse. A doctor named Jarvis was summoned from his office 3 blocks away. The doctor arrived within 15 minutes. He worked for half an hour. Toward the end of that half hour, a second doctor arrived. Between them, they pronounced William Ralston dead at 3:35 in the afternoon of August the 27th, 1875. The coroner's inquest was held the following morning. It was brief. The coroner examined the body, heard testimony from the 2 doctors, and returned a verdict of death by cerebral apoplexy brought on by sudden immersion in cold water. Apoplexy was the period's word for stroke. It was a convenient diagnosis. It allowed the life insurance policies on Ralston's head, worth some $750,000, to pay out in full. Suicide would have voided them. A family in his condition needed that money. The coroner was a kind man. The verdict was accepted. Historians have never quite believed it. Ralston was an accomplished swimmer. He had entered the water in the middle of a financial catastrophe that had stripped him of everything he owned. He had walked 2 miles to reach the bay. He had gone straight from the signing of the deed of trust to the dock. The chain of events admits of more than one reading. Some have argued for stroke, others for heart failure, a few for accident, many more, quietly, for suicide. The question has never been settled, and perhaps cannot be. The ambiguity is the closest thing to a resolution the story permits. The city's grief was immediate, total, and almost religious in its intensity. San Francisco had worshipped Ralston. Now it mourned him with a ferocity that made William Sharon, walking to his carriage the next morning, look pointedly the other way. The body lay and stayed at Belmont for 2 days. 20,000 people filed past it. The funeral itself was held at Calvary Presbyterian Church on Powell Street. The streets surrounding it were so packed that mourners stood on rooftops and leaned from upper windows. The cortege that carried him to Lone Mountain Cemetery stretched 2 miles long. 50,000 people lined its route. The flags of the city were at half-mast. Every bank on Montgomery Street closed for the day. Every brothel on Pacific Avenue closed for the day. It was said, with only moderate exaggeration, that the only businesses open in San Francisco that afternoon were the morgue and the telegraph office. At Belmont, his widow Elizabeth received the mourners in a black dress. She did not cry. She had already cried. She spoke to everyone who came to the door, and she thanked each of them by name. A reporter for the San Francisco Call, allowed inside for 10 minutes, wrote that she moved through the rooms of her husband's mansion as if she were a visitor to a house she had never seen before. Which, in a legal sense, she now was. The house had been signed away with everything else. And then, with a timing so exquisite it seemed almost deliberate, came the choreographed resurrection. On October 2nd, 1875, just 35 days after Ralston's drowning, 2 events occurred in San Francisco simultaneously. At 10 in the morning, the Bank of California opened its doors. William Sharon stood on the steps in a black frock coat and shook the hand of the first depositor. A brass band played. A reporter from the Daily Alta California described it as a moment of civic reaffirmation. Sharon accepted, gravely, the congratulations of the directors. He made a short speech. He thanked, by name, no one. At 3 in the afternoon, 5 blocks away, the Palace Hotel opened. The Grand Court had been festooned with California poppies. The 512 gas jets were blazing by noon. A receiving line of 300 dignitaries stretched through the marble lobby. William Sharon stood at the head of the line. He greeted the governor. He greeted the mayor. He greeted the delegations from the railroad, the Silver Exchange, the mining companies. Above his head, in gold letters across the marble mantel of the lobby fireplace, the letters P.H. had been set into the stone. They stood, officially, for Palace Hotel. They also stood for the ghost of the man whose initials they had been carved around. William Ralston's widow was not invited. Neither were his children. Neither was any photograph of him, any mention of his name, any commemorative tablet. Sharon had, in the weeks between the funeral and the opening, given instructions to the hotel staff that Ralston's role in the building's creation was not to be discussed with guests. The record was to be simplified. The palace, the staff were told, was Sharon's creation. The past was not to be brought up. He was erased from his own masterpiece, not by time, by design. And the water that had watched him build all of it had closed over him so quickly that by October 2nd, when the first guests signed the register and the orchestra began to play, the name of the man who had raised every brick of the building above their heads was already, in the halls of his own palace, a whisper that fewer and fewer people remembered to speak. Chapter 10. The Widow in the 7th Floor Suite. Sharon offered Elizabeth Ralston 7 rooms in the hotel that had killed her husband, and for a little while she accepted. It was, in its way, a gesture. It was also, in its way, a punishment. Sharon told her, in the weeks after the funeral, that she and the 4 children could live in the hotel, rent-free, for as long as she wished. The suite he assigned her was on the 7th floor, It looked east across Market Street toward the bay. It had a view on a clear morning of the water near North Beach in which her husband had died. She moved in before Christmas of 1875. She had nowhere else to go. Belmont had been sold to Sharon as part of the deed of trust, along with the Mission Woolen Mills and the Kimball Works and every other property in her husband's name. She brought with her a small trunk of personal things, a portrait of her husband in his 30s, and a black leather-bound Bible in which she had begun, shortly after the funeral, to write down what she remembered. She stayed almost 4 years. In that time, she watched the palace become the most famous hotel on the North American continent. Kings came, generals came, opera singers came. Mark Twain, passing through on a lecture tour, they stayed for 2 weeks and wrote a letter to his wife, describing the place as a small, walled city. Oscar Wilde, arriving in 1882, was greeted in the Grand Court by 300 people and a 15-minute ovation. He wore a velvet coat and a lily in his buttonhole, and he later told a reporter that the palace was, quote, "the most magnificent hotel in America," unquote. The royalty came too. In 1879, former President Ulysses S. Grant stayed for 10 days as part of his round-the-world tour. The hotel threw a banquet for 800 in his honor. In 1891, King Kalakaua of Hawaii arrived gravely ill. He was given the royal suite on the 2nd floor. A Hawaiian flag was flown from the roof. Doctors attended him around the clock. He died in the suite on January 20th of that year, as the last reigning king of an independent Hawaiian kingdom. His body was embalmed in a small room near the laundry, then carried by special train to the Oakland Ferry and home across the Pacific. The hotel's register recorded, under the date of his death, simply Kalakaua, King. Sharon, meanwhile, prospered. He took his seat in the Senate only rarely. He returned to San Francisco. He expanded the palace's investments. He built another estate, grander than Belmont, at the southern end of the peninsula. He fought a protracted and humiliating legal battle with a woman named Sarah Althea Hill, who claimed to be his secret wife. The case ran for years. It ended only with his death in November of 1885, at the age of 64. He left a fortune of between $30 and $50 million. Almost all of it had come, indirectly or indirectly, from the empire Ralston had built. Elizabeth watched all of it from her 7th-floor rooms. She took her meals in the suite. She walked in the evenings through the quieter corridors where the chambermaids, who had loved her husband, would sometimes curtsy to her as she passed. She attended no banquets. She saw no royalty. She kept the door to the sitting room slightly open so that she could, in the late afternoons, hear the orchestra playing in the Grand Court 7 floors below. The music came up softly through the courtyard, broken by the sound of carriage wheels on the marble and by the long, low call of the bellboys announcing arrivals. Some nights she could not bear it. Some nights she sat by the window and watched the fog come in across the bay, and she imagined him, as he must have looked on that last afternoon, walking down to the water. Some nights she wrote in her Bible. One surviving line reads simply, "I do not know what he thought at the last, but I know that he loved us, and I know that he could not stop himself, and I know that I am tired, and I know that tomorrow I will walk again in his hotel, and I will hear him in every stairwell." In the autumn of 1879, she left. She did not explain her reasons to Sharon. She moved with her children to a modest house in the Western Addition. She lived quietly, without the palace, for the rest of her life. She outlived her husband by 34 years. She died in 1909. Friends who visited her in her final decade said that she rarely mentioned the hotel. When she did, she referred to it only as that building, never by its name. The suite on the 7th floor was renumbered and rented to paying guests. The view of the bay remained, but what she had been unable to live with was not the view. It was the fact that every time she walked into the grand court, she stood inside the ribs of her husband's last idea, and she could not tell from the smile of the man at the front desk whether he knew whose hotel it was. He did not. And the invisible erasure continued, month by month, year by year, inside the most visible building in the American West. Chapter 11. The fire that finished what the water began. At 12 minutes past 5 on the morning of April 18th, 1906, Enrico Caruso watched a chandelier try to touch the ceiling. The great tenor had arrived in San Francisco 2 days earlier, to sing the role of Don Jose in a traveling production of Carmen at the Grand Opera House. He was 33 years old and at the peak of his powers. He had spent the evening of the 17th drinking champagne with the conductor, Alfred Hertz, in the palace's private dining room. He had been put to bed by his valet sometime after midnight. He was sleeping heavily in a suite on the 5th floor, room 580. At 5:12 in the morning, the earthquake struck. Caruso later described it as a swaying, as if the palace were a great ship riding a heavy sea. The chandelier above his bed began to swing, then to arc, then to crash against the plaster of the ceiling. He leapt from the bed. The walls buckled, the floor rolled. He ran into the corridor in his nightshirt, clutching a signed photograph of President Theodore Roosevelt. He ran down 7 flights of stairs. He emerged into the grand court, where men and women in bedclothes and evening wear stood staring up through the glass roof as the sky impossibly shook itself. The quake lasted 47 seconds. Its magnitude has been estimated at 7.9 on the modern scale. It leveled entire blocks of the south of Market District. It toppled the City Hall dome. It broke every water main in the city. The palace survived the shake. This was not accident. It was design. John Gaynor's walls, ribbed with iron, had behaved exactly as he had predicted. The building swayed, cracked at a few corners, lost some decorative plaster, and held. A Scientific American correspondent, inspecting it 2 days later, found the main structure nearly unharmed. The ironclad had done its job. The fire was another matter. Within an hour of the quake, 100 separate fires had broken out in the eastern and southern parts of the city. They merged. They became a wall. By 8 in the morning, the flames were moving up Market Street toward the palace at a rate that Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, mortally injured in the earthquake, could not rise from his bed to fight. The firefighters turned their hoses on the flames and received, from the broken hydrants, not water, but a thin brown trickle, and then nothing. The municipal water supply had failed. The palace had its own water. That was the point. 675,000 gallons in the great cistern beneath the cellar. 4 artesian wells pumping fresh from the ground. A roof reservoir. An independent pumping engine. The building had been designed to fight, alone, a fire that the city could not, and for a time it did. The hotel's own firefighters, trained staff led by the chief engineer, began pumping at 6 in the morning. They wet down the exterior walls. They soaked the cornices. They ran hoses up the service stairs. The building held. At 10 in the morning, the general manager sent a telegram to Sharon's heirs, still in their beds across town. "The palace," he wrote, "is safe. Do not fear." It was the last telegram sent from the building. At 11, the fire department, desperate to save the rest of Market Street, commandeered the palace's own hoses. They pulled water from the hotel's cistern to fight the flames in the neighboring blocks. They pulled and pulled and pulled. By 2 in the afternoon, the cistern beneath the palace was empty. At 4 in the afternoon, the flames reached the hotel. The bar was, at that hour, still open. The bartenders, 2 brothers named O'Brien, had kept pouring drinks for the fleeing refugees all day. As the smoke thickened in the lobby, they stepped out from behind the counter and began, quite deliberately, to give away the entire inventory. Men and women sat on the Grand Court floor drinking $20 champagne and $50 Bordeaux as the east wall began to glow. The orchestra, which had played every afternoon for 30 years, did not play that day. The piano had been carried out into the street an hour earlier. The flames took the palace from the east. They came through the 6th floor service windows first, then climbed the brocade curtains, then rolled across the ceiling of the Grand Court. The glass roof did not shatter all at once. It came down in pieces, melting, over a period of perhaps 20 minutes. By 6 in the evening, the Grand Court was a furnace. By 9, the upper floors were gone. By midnight, only the outer walls remained. They stood. The iron banding held them up, even as the interior burned out beneath them. In the morning, the palace was a hollow shell of brick, 9 stories high, with the sky visible through every window. Photographs taken on April 20th show the building looking almost like a Roman ruin, like something that had always been half a memory. It had lived exactly 30 years, 6 months, and 16 days. The cistern that had been built to make it fireproof had been drained in the end to save other buildings. The iron ribs that had been meant to hold it against any disaster had survived the disaster and held up a corpse. The water had finished what the water had begun. Ralston had drowned in the bay that his hotel could not keep him from. His hotel had burned because its own water had been given away to a city that had once lined up, 50,000 strong, to mourn him, and had then quite thoroughly forgotten him. The last guest to leave the palace that day was a salesman from Boston who had checked in the night before and who had not unpacked. He walked out through the Market Street entrance at 4:30, carrying a single suitcase. He turned once at the corner of Montgomery and looked back. Smoke was already curling from the upper windows. He wrote later, in a letter to his wife, that the building had looked, for one moment, as if it were simply exhaling. Chapter 12. What the silver could not buy. The palace that stands today is not Ralston's palace, and that finally is the truth his ambition could never admit. After the fire, the Sharon estate made a decision that Sharon himself, in his cautious way, might not have made. The heirs chose to rebuild. They hired the architectural firm of Trowbridge and Livingston, New York men, well-known, expensive. They tore down the blackened brick walls that had stood through the earthquake. They cleared the block. They began in 1907 to raise a new building on the same footprint. The new palace opened on December 19th, 1909. It was, in many ways, a different structure. It was only 8 stories tall instead of the original 9. Its rooms were larger. Its courtyard had been roofed in an even grander glass and iron dome, now called the Garden Court. Its lobby was Italian marble instead of Vermont. Its kitchens could serve, at peak, 3,000 meals a day. It was, in the language of the 20th century, modern. It had electric lifts instead of hydraulic rising rooms. It had telephones in every room. It had a ballroom in which presidents would, over the next 50 years, declare foreign policy. What it did not have was Ralston. His name did not appear on the new cornerstone. His portrait was not hung in the lobby. His widow, by then in the last winter of her life, did not attend the reopening. She had been invited. She declined. The only place in the new palace where William Ralston survived was a small private dining room, just off the main lobby, which was called, without fanfare, the Ralston Room. It held about 20 guests at a long table. It had a single framed photograph of Ralston on the wall, the one taken a few months before his death, in which he looks tired and slightly hopeful and very far away. The room was used in the early decades, mostly for private bankers' dinners and wedding rehearsals. Most guests never saw it. Most guests never asked why it was called what it was called. That, perhaps, is the truth that the silver could never buy. A man can spend $5 million on brick and iron. A man can move a city to build with him. A man can be wept for in his coffin by 50,000 strangers. And still, in the building that he raised with his own breath and his own ruin, he can become, within a single generation, a framed face on a wall in a small room that most people walk past without noticing. There is an arithmetic to ambition that we like to pretend does not apply. We tell ourselves that if we build fast enough, big enough, bright enough, the books will balance in the end, and the world will remember us for what we made rather than what we owed. William Ralston believed that arithmetic. He believed it so completely that he mortgaged every brick of his masterpiece against the belief. And when the numbers turned, as numbers always do, he found, at the bottom of a deed of trust, and then at the bottom of a bay, that the world had not agreed to his terms. The silver of the Comstock did not last. It came out of the mountain in a rush of impossible years, and then it thinned, and then it stopped. $300 million, 3 generations of fortune, and at the end, the mountain was a honeycomb of abandoned shafts, and the town at its foot was a ghost of itself. The bank that Ralston built survived him, and then survived Sharon, and then was absorbed in 1905 into another institution, and then was absorbed into another, and is now merely a footnote in the history of California finance. The Belmont estate, sold and resold, became, eventually, a college campus. Students walk through the old ballroom now without knowing whose it was. And yet, if you stand on Market Street today at the corner of New Montgomery and look up at the long pale wall of the Palace Hotel, you can still trace, in the proportions of the building, the ghost of the original. The new palace was built on the old foundations. The artesian wells, sealed long ago, still lie somewhere beneath the sub-basement. The iron bones of the original walls are buried in the fill. The building is a palimpsest. It is written over, but the first writing is still there, beneath the surface, waiting for the kind of reader who knows to look. Out at Marina Green, on the edge of the bay, a modest stone memorial stands near the water. It bears Ralston's name. It is small. It is easily missed. Joggers pass it without glancing up. Tourists photograph the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance and never notice the stone. The memorial looks out across roughly the same stretch of green water into which he walked on the afternoon of August the 27th, 1875. The bay does not remember him. The bay does not remember anyone. It folds over every dive and every swimmer and every ending, and it gives back, each morning, the same clean green surface. But history remembers, if you are patient enough to listen for it. History remembers a boy from Wellsville, Ohio, who crossed an ocean and built a city. It remembers a silver empire swallowed by its own appetite. It remembers a partner with piranha patience and 4 cold words spoken in a boardroom. It remembers 800 fireplaces upstairs and $8 a month downstairs. It remembers a signature that cost a fortune, and a swim that took a soul, and a hotel that opened on the same afternoon as the bank that had killed its builder. An empire built on the speed at which silver becomes debt cannot outrun its own arithmetic. Scale is never a substitute for time. A monument to immortality is still, in the end, only a monument, and monuments belong to whoever owns the deed. The palace still opens its doors each morning. The garden court serves tea beneath the glass. The marble still holds the morning light. And somewhere in a small room off the lobby, a photograph of a tired, hopeful man looks out across a table that will be set tonight for strangers who will eat their dinner without knowing whose house they have entered, and without knowing that, outside, 150 years of fog has been trying, very patiently, to tell them.